There is a form I sign at every building, and before I get into any of this, I want to be clear about that form, because the form is going to be the part of this account that the city points to when they say I am wrong. The form is a single page. It is called a vacancy attestation. It has 15 check boxes and one signature line. I signed every form I was handed for 2 years and 7 months on the job. My signatures are on file in the demolition records office at City Hall, in the contractor copies kept by each of the 4 demolition firms we used, and on the back end of the city's permit tracking system, where each form is scanned and indexed by address. The records will say that I performed my work correctly and in good faith. I am not arguing with that. I am writing this because there is a difference between doing your job correctly and your job being correct, and I would like that difference to exist somewhere on paper that is not the city's paper. I worked for the Department of Building Standards in Allensbridge as a Section 304 pre-demolition coordinator. The job title is precise, and it is also, in practical terms, a name for a person who walks through buildings before they get knocked down. There were 4 of us in the city when I was hired. There are now 6. The reason for the increase, as my supervisor explained it to me, was that the city had a backlog. There were 2,000 condemned and abandoned structures on the list. The city had committed, in a public-private agreement with a redevelopment consortium, to clear 900 of them within 4 years. That math worked out to about 5 buildings per coordinator per day. Every working day for 48 months. I joined in the 2nd year. The pace was already aggressive when I started. I want to describe the work plainly because the work was, until late in my time on the job, almost entirely uneventful. I would arrive at the field office on Mason Street at 6:30 in the morning. The dispatcher, a woman named Lourdes Ribeiro, would have the day's packets stacked on the counter by name. My packet had 4 to 7 addresses in it, depending on building size. Each address came with a contractor name, a demolition window, usually 24 to 72 hours after sign-off, and a vacancy attestation form, blank, paper-clipped to the address sheet. I would take my packet, walk to the city truck assigned to me, drive to the first address, and start. The walkthrough procedure was the same at every building. Park where the contractor's lead truck would park, usually on the demolition side of the property. Do a perimeter walk first, slow, looking for footprints in the dust, fresh trash, signs that someone had been at the building recently. Then go to the utility connections, the water shut-off and the electrical mast. Verify both were disconnected at the source. The contractor's pre-team was supposed to have done this 2 days earlier, but I checked anyway, because if the utilities were live during demolition, you could electrocute a worker or flood a basement. After the utilities, I went inside, top floor first, working down, every room, every closet, flashlight on even during the day, because most of these buildings had been shut up for months or years, and the windows were boarded. I would call out as I entered each room, "City Inspector, anyone here?" Not because I expected an answer, but because that was what the procedure manual said to do. I would check under stairs, behind any furniture left in place, inside any built-in cabinet that could fit a person. I would go to the basement last. I would check the basement carefully because basements are where people sleep when they have nowhere else to go. When I was satisfied the building was empty of people, animals, and significant personal effects, I would come back outside, hang a numbered orange tag on the front door, and fill out the vacancy attestation on the hood of the truck. The 15 check boxes were exterior condition, perimeter access points, basement access, primary entries, secondary entries, attic access, utilities verified off its source, no occupants observed, no animals observed, no livestock or wildlife enclosure, no evidence of ongoing occupancy, no significant personal effects, no environmental hazards beyond those listed in the original condemnation report, contractor staging area suitable, and clearance to demolish within the noted window. 15 boxes, 1 signature. Then I would drive the form to the contractor's job trailer, drop it in their inbox, get a date stamp receipt, and drive to the next address. 5 buildings a day, maybe 6 if they were small, maybe 4 if one was a multi-story commercial and took an hour to walk. The work paid $43,000 a year with city benefits, which in Allensbridge was a perfectly fine living, and I had taken it because my back had started to give out from 23 years of framing carpentry, and I needed something that involved walking instead of lifting. I was 46 when I was hired. I am 48 now. That is the relevant biographical context. I am not a man given to imagination, by which I mean, when something at a building struck me as odd, I noted it, considered it, and either signed off or didn't sign off based on what I had actually seen, not on what I was afraid I might be missing. I want to make this clear because most of what follows is going to sound like I missed obvious things, and I want the record to show that I did not consider myself the kind of inspector who missed things. The first building where I noticed something I could not explain was a two-story mixed-use commercial structure on the 400 block of Oxnard Avenue. It had been a dry cleaner on the ground floor and two apartments above. The dry cleaner had closed in 2009. The building had been condemned for structural reasons in 2017. It had been empty, by every account in the packet, for almost 6 years. It was a Tuesday in March. I walked the perimeter, verified the utilities, hung the door tag at the bottom step so I would remember to move it up after the inspection, and went inside. The dry cleaner space on the ground floor was as it should have been. Dust, abandoned racks. The sour chemical smell of solvents that had soaked into the floor over decades and would not leave even after the building was rubble. I cleared it. I went up the back stairs to the second floor. The first apartment was empty. The second apartment had a kitchen counter that had been left clean. That was unusual, but not impossible. The previous tenant could have wiped it down on the way out, and the dust hadn't settled in some particular pattern. I crossed the kitchen and put my hand on the counter to brace myself while I checked under the sink. The counter was warm. I want to describe what I mean. It was not body warm. It was not the temperature of skin, but it was a few degrees warmer than the surrounding air, which was mid-50s, the kind of cold a vacant building gets in early March when the heat has been off for 6 years. The counter was warmer than that. It felt like a counter that someone had been leaning against, with their forearms on it, for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe 20. The warmth was concentrated in two oval patches about 18 inches apart, where forearms would go. I moved my hand. I checked the patches. I felt the rest of the counter. The rest of the counter was cold. The two oval patches were the only warm spots. I stood there for some time. I considered the possibilities. The most reasonable possibility was that I had imagined the temperature difference, that my own hand was cold from the steering wheel, and the contrast had registered as warmth where there was none. The second possibility was that sunlight had come through one of the boarded windows and warmed the counter in two specific spots. I checked the windows. They were intact and fully boarded. There was no sunlight on the counter. The third possibility I did not want to think about, so I did what I had been trained to do, which was to expand the search. I went back through the apartment. I opened the closets I had already checked. I opened the bathroom door. I went up to the attic access in the hallway and pushed up the panel and shone my flashlight into the crawlspace. There was no one in the apartment. There was no one in the building. There were no signs of recent occupancy except for the two warm patches on the counter. I went outside. I sat in the truck for about 5 minutes. Then I filled out the vacancy attestation. I checked all 15 boxes. I signed it. I drove it to the contractor's trailer. The building was demolished 48 hours later, and I drove past the site on my way to a different job and saw the lot full of broken cinder block and twisted lath. And I thought about it for a few more minutes, and then I let it go. The reason I let it go is that I had 4 more buildings on my packet that day, and I was already running behind. That is the actual reason. I want to record it because it is true, and because in the months that followed, I would have many opportunities to let things go for the same reason, and I want to be honest about how those opportunities accumulated. The second incident was in late April at a single-family house on Halstead Court. The house had been a rental property that had gone through a complicated foreclosure, and it had been vacant according to the packet for 14 months. I did the walkthrough normally. The house was small, a single story with a partial basement, and the walkthrough took less than 15 minutes. The basement was where I noticed the smell. It was cigarette smoke, fresh cigarette smoke. The basement was a finished basement with a low ceiling and a concrete floor, and there was a card table in the corner with one chair and on the table was a coffee tin, and in the coffee tin were 3 cigarette butts and a 4th cigarette, still lit, still drawing thin smoke up toward the ceiling. I stood at the foot of the stairs and looked at the cigarette and counted to 10 in my head. Then I called out, "City Inspector, anyone here?" I waited. The basement was silent except for the small electrical hum of nothing in particular. The kind of hum you imagine in a room where there is nothing electrical because your ears have nothing else to hold on to. I went over to the table. I picked up the cigarette. The end was hot. I put it out in the tin. I went back upstairs. I rechecked every room, every closet, the attic, the small unfinished portion of the basement that was a crawl space under the kitchen. I did not find anyone. The utilities were off. I rechecked them too. The breaker box was tripped at the main. The water main was closed at the curb and tagged. Someone had been in the basement smoking a cigarette in a building with no electricity, in a house with no resident and no rental tenant and no listing for almost a year and a half. They had been there long enough to smoke at least 4 cigarettes. They were not there now. I want to record what I did, which was, I went outside. I walked the perimeter again. I looked at the back of the house. The back door was locked. The windows were intact and boarded. I looked at the front of the house. Same. I looked at the basement window from the outside. It was a narrow rectangular window at ground level, and it was intact and boarded over from the inside. I went around the entire house. There was no point of entry that I could see. I considered calling the supervisor. I considered very seriously refusing to sign. I considered, with what I want to call professional realism, what would happen if I refused to sign at this building. The contractor was already staged with equipment 1 block over, ready to start at the demolition window. The demolition window opened the next morning at 7. If I refused to sign, the contractor would not be able to start. The supervisor, a man named Doheny, would have to come out and rewalk the building with me. Doheny would find what I had found, or would not, and would make his own decision. Doheny was not a person I wanted to call out for a half-finished cigarette in a tin. I went back inside. I checked everything one more time. I came out. I filled out the vacancy attestation. I checked all 15 boxes. I signed it. The house was demolished the next morning. I drove past it on my way out of that route. The crew was already loading the first dumpster. I want to describe, before I move on, the way I felt about the cigarette in the days afterward. I did not feel afraid. I felt mildly embarrassed, the way you feel when you have done something you cannot fully justify, but which fell within the procedure you were supposed to follow. I had done my walkthrough. I had checked all the spaces. I had not found anyone. The cigarette was unexplained, but the cigarette did not by itself make the building occupied. I had filled out the form correctly. The form does not have a checkbox for unexplained signs of recent presence with no person located. The form has only what it has. In May, on a Wednesday, a neighbor at one of the buildings I had cleared in late April reported to the contractor that during the demolition, the wrecking crew had pulled down a wall on the ground floor and exposed what the neighbor described, with some embarrassment, as a small living space inside the wall. There had been a sleeping bag, a milk crate, a bottle of water, a flashlight. There had been no person. There was, however, what the police later determined to be evidence of recent occupancy within the previous week, possibly within the previous 24 hours. The crew shut down the demolition. The police came out. The demolition contractor called the city. The city called Doheny. Doheny called me. Doheny was a calm man in his late 50s who had been in building inspections for a long time and knew the difference between a problem and a procedure failure. He did not blame me. He told me in his office that the police were going to want to talk to me and that I should answer their questions plainly, and that the city was going to back me up because I had followed the procedure. The wall cavity, he said, was not a space that a coordinator could be expected to identify during a normal walkthrough. It was an interior wall between the kitchen and the dining room of the foreclosed house, and someone had cut a small access panel into the back of a built-in pantry shelf, and the access panel had been hidden behind a row of empty mason jars. There was no way I could have seen it. The procedure does not require a coordinator to disassemble building cabinetry. I told Doheny that the cigarette in the basement of the Halstead courthouse had been recent. I had not reported it at the time because I had searched the building and found no one, and because I had cleared the walkthrough on its merits, and because I had thought the cigarette was. And here Doheny held up his hand and he said, Kevin, the walkthrough is the walkthrough. You do not investigate, you confirm. If the building looked clear to you, you signed off on it correctly. We will not be having a conversation about the cigarette. He said it the way he said things that were both kind and final, and I understood it as both, and I did not bring up the cigarette again. The police interviewed me the following week. They were polite. They had me describe the walkthrough in detail. They asked me whether I had seen a person, heard a person, or seen any evidence at the time that someone might be in the building. I said I had not. They asked whether I had reported anything unusual. I said I had not. They thanked me for my time. They closed the interview after 11 minutes. The case, as far as I know, was never resolved. The wrecking crew had pulled the wall down before the person could be found. The person, if there had been a person at the time of demolition, and the police were not certain there had been, had either left before the wall came down or had been in the wall when it came down and had been carried out in the debris, undetected and disposed of with the rest of the rubble. I am told the demolition contractor sifted the debris with a metal detector at the request of the police and found nothing organic. I do not know what to do with that information. I have not pursued it. What I want to record is the conversation I had with Doheny 3 weeks after the wall incident, because it is the conversation that allowed me to keep working. I went into his office on a Tuesday afternoon after my route, and I told him I was concerned about the pace of the work. I told him about the warm counter on Oxnard Avenue. I told him about the cigarette. I told him I felt, in a way I did not want to feel, that I might be missing things. I told him I was willing to keep working, but that I wanted him to know I had concerns. Doheny listened. He waited until I was finished. Then he said something I have thought about often since. He said, Kevin, I will tell you the truth, which is that every coordinator on this team has had a building like that. Almost every coordinator has had 2 or 3. There are buildings on our list that have been used as squats for years. There are people who have figured out how to live in a wall, in an attic, behind a chimney chase, in a crawl space under a porch. They are good at hiding. They are better at it than we are at finding them. Your job is not to find them. Your job is to make a reasonable inspection of the accessible spaces and to certify what you observe. If you observe a person, you do not sign. If you observe evidence of a person and search and find no person, you sign. This is the policy. This is also the only way the work can get done. If we required the coordinator to certify with absolute confidence that no human being was anywhere in the building, we would not demolish another building in the city ever. The list is 2,000 buildings long, 5 buildings a day. You see the math? He let me sit with that. Then he said, I am not telling you this to make you feel better. I am telling you so that the next time you feel a warm counter or smell a cigarette, you know what your job is and what it is not. The job is to walk and confirm and sign. The job is not to be 100% sure. There is no version of this work where you are 100% sure. I appreciated this conversation at the time. I want to be honest about that too. I left his office feeling like the institutional weight of the procedure was taking the moral weight off me, which was, I now understand, exactly what the conversation was for. The procedure exists so that the person doing the procedure does not have to be 100% sure. The person is doing what was asked. The certainty, such as it is, lives somewhere else in the system, distributed across many roles, and no single person is required to hold the whole thing. I want to put this conversation on the record because it is the explanation I gave myself for why I kept signing. It is not an excuse. It is what I told myself accurately at the time. In June, I encountered a person face to face. The building was a 2-story house on Vereen Street, brick veneer, small front porch, an old detached garage in the back. The packet listed it as condemned for water damage and vacant for 9 months. I parked, did the perimeter walk, verified the utilities, which were off, and went up the front steps. I was about to put my key in the front door lockbox when the front door opened from the inside. The man on the other side was perhaps 60 years old, tall, with a gray mustache and a flannel shirt and work pants. He was holding a cup of coffee. He looked at me with the polite, mild surprise of a person who had not expected to find a stranger on his porch, but was prepared to be helpful about it. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'm Kevin Oresco with the Department of Building Standards. I'm here for the pre-demolition walkthrough." He looked at me. He did not look surprised exactly, but he looked like he was trying to fit what I had said into a context he had been operating in. He said, "The pre-demolition walkthrough." I said, "Yes, sir. The building is scheduled for demolition. I'm here to do the final inspection before the contractor mobilizes." He said, "I think there's been a mistake. We live here." I want to describe the physical sensation of that sentence. It was a small drop in my stomach, the kind you get when you have read a number wrong and are about to find out how wrong. I asked him whether the address of the property was 818 Vereen Street. He said it was. I asked him whether he was the owner of the property. He said he was. I asked him to wait while I checked my paperwork. He said he would. I went back to the truck. I pulled the packet for that address. The address sheet listed 818 Vereen Street, condemned status, owner of record listed as a holding company called Beldum Equity Partners, LLC, last property tax payment in arrears since 2 years prior, water service disconnected 14 months prior, electrical service disconnected 11 months prior, original condemnation report citing severe water damage to load-bearing structures. I went back to the porch. I asked the man if I could see some identification or proof of residency. He went inside and came back with a Pennsylvania driver's license and a recent utility bill. The driver's license was valid and showed his name and the 818 Vereen Street address. The utility bill was for natural gas service, dated the previous month, in his name, at the same address, paid current. I stood on the porch. I told him I was going to need to call my supervisor. I called Doheny. I described the situation. Doheny was quiet for a moment and then said, "Don't sign it. Come back to the office. We'll get the paperwork sorted out." I told the man I was sorry for the disturbance and that there had clearly been some kind of mix-up at the records office. He was gracious about it. He said these things happen. He said he hoped it would get straightened out before anyone showed up with a wrecking crane. I said I was sure it would. I left. At the office, Doheny pulled up the property records on his computer while I sat across from him. The city's tax records showed the property as Beldum Equity Partners, LLC, condemned, vacant. The county recorder's records showed the same. Doheny called the gas utility. The gas utility confirmed there was an active account at 818 Vereen Street in the name the man had given me, with consistent monthly billing for the past 4 years. Doheny called the water utility. The water utility confirmed that service had been disconnected 14 months prior at the request of the property owner, Beldum Equity Partners, LLC, and had not been reconnected. Doheny sat back in his chair. He said, "Well, this is a clusterfuck." He said, "Somebody's records are wrong. I'll get it sorted. We won't demolish the building until we figure out who actually lives there." He told me to take the rest of the afternoon off. I went home. 3 days later, I drove past 818 Vereen Street on my way to a different building. The house was rubble. The demolition had happened on schedule, on the morning after I had refused to sign. The contractor's vehicles were gone. The lot was a flat field of broken brick. I want to describe what I did. I parked the truck. I sat in the cab. I did not get out. I called Doheny. Doheny did not pick up. I called Lords at the dispatch desk. I asked her if 818 Vereen Street had been demolished. She checked her records. She said yes. She said the vacancy attestation had been filed 2 days ago and the demolition window had opened on schedule. I asked her who had signed the vacancy attestation. She said she could not tell from her screen, but could pull the form. I waited. She said the form had been signed by Kevin Oresco, dated the afternoon of the day I had walked the building, time stamped at 4:15 p.m. I was sitting in the truck at 4:15 p.m. that day, in Doheny's office, waiting for him to call the gas utility. I had been with Doheny for the entirety of that afternoon, from approximately 3:30 until 5:30. I had not signed anything for 818 Vereen Street. I had not signed anything for any building that day after 11 a.m. I asked Lords to read the signature back to me. She said, Just a second. Let me look at the scan. She came back. She said, "It's your signature, Kevin. K.A.R.E.N.C.O. with the loop on the K and the long line under the O. That is, in fact, how I sign my name. I have signed it that way since I was 16. I told Lourdes I needed to talk to Doheny. She said he was out at a site visit. I asked her to have him call me. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen with the lights off for some time. What I did next is the part of this account that I want to describe carefully, because the part I did not do is more important than the part I did. I did not call the police. I will tell you why. The man at 818 Vereen Street was alive when I left him. The house was demolished before the next morning. If the man was inside the house when it was demolished, that was a homicide. And the homicide was committed by the demolition contractor, and the homicide was authorized by a vacancy attestation form bearing my forged signature. If I called the police, I would be reporting a homicide that I would have to prove I had not authorized. I would have to prove that the signature on the form was not mine. The signature on the form was mine. It would be my word against my own handwriting. I want to be honest about what I considered. I considered driving back to the lot and checking the rubble for a body. I did not. I considered with some shame that the man might have left the house after I did, the way the squatters in the wall cavities had left before the wrecking ball came. I considered that the demolition contractor would have done a final pre-demolition walk of their own. They did, by their procedures, do a final pre-demolition walk, and would have stopped the demolition if they had found anyone inside. What I did was, I called Doheny again the next morning. He picked up. I told him about 818 Vereen Street. I told him I had refused to sign and that the demolition had happened anyway, and that the vacancy attestation was on file with my signature. Doheny was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Kevin, I want you to come into the office today and we will sit down and we will go over your forms from the past month and we will figure out where the wires got crossed. There is an explanation for this. There is always an explanation for this." I went in, we went over the forms, the signatures were all consistent, the dates were all consistent. The 818 Vereen Street form was, by every external measure, valid. Doheny told me he believed me that I had not signed it. He told me that someone, somewhere in the chain, had either forged my signature or used an old signature on a different form to backfill the record. He said the most likely explanation was that the contractor had been given a pre-signed form by someone in the office, and that the contractor had submitted that form when the actual form had been refused. He said he would investigate. He said he would find out who in the office had pre-signed forms in their possession. He said he would call me when he had answers. He did not call me. I went back to work the next day. I did my route. I walked 5 buildings. I signed 5 vacancy attestations. I want to describe the next month because the next month is when I made the decisions that I am writing this account to record. I started, after the 818 Vereen Street incident, to drive past the buildings I had cleared, the day after demolition. Not all of them, most of them. Just to confirm with my own eyes that the buildings had come down on schedule. Most of them had. They were rubble lots, construction debris dumpsters, empty parcels. But I started to notice a pattern about the buildings, which I had not noticed before because I had not had reason to look for it. The buildings on my packets were not always on the city's public demolition schedule. The city published a weekly demolition list. Addresses, dates, contractor names, for residents to know what was coming down in their neighborhood. Most of my buildings were on the list. Some of them were not. I started keeping track. I want to be clear about how I kept track. I did not write anything down. I did not photograph anything. I memorized the addresses of the buildings that did not appear on the public list, and I checked them against the public list each week from a public library computer that did not require my city login. By the end of June, I had memorized 17 addresses that had been on my packets, but had never appeared on the public demolition schedule. All 17 had been demolished. I had driven past all 17 lots. The 17 had certain things in common. They were all single-family or small multifamily residential buildings. They were all in the older parts of the city, north of the river. They were all owned, on paper, by holding companies. Beldam Equity Partners, LLC, Vinland Realty Trust, Argosy Property Holdings, 2 or 3 others. The holding companies, when I looked them up at the library, all listed the same registered agent, a law firm called Tally Rourke and Bain. I did not know what to do with this. I want to be honest, I am not an investigator. I am a man who walks buildings before they come down. I had information, partial, circumstantial, uncertain, that suggested a pattern, and I had no idea what the pattern meant or who was behind it, or whether I was, again, imagining things in the way that a man who had worked too many buildings might imagine things. What I did in the 3rd week of July was that I started declining buildings. I want to be precise about how I declined. I did not refuse to walk them. I walked every building I was assigned. But I started to be more aggressive about what I considered evidence of occupancy. A coffee cup on a counter became occupancy. A folded blanket became occupancy. A child's drawing on a wall became occupancy. I refused to sign at 4 buildings in 2 weeks. Doheny called me into his office at the end of the 2nd week. He was not angry. He was patient in the way he had been patient at the beginning, which I recognize now as the patience of a man who had a problem and needed to manage it carefully. He said, "Kevin, you've refused 4 signatures in 12 days. The previous 12 months, you refused 2. What's going on?" I told him I was being more thorough. He said, "You're being more thorough." Okay, I appreciate the thoroughness. The contractors are not appreciating the thoroughness. Each refusal puts a building back into the queue and slows the schedule. We have an obligation to the consortium to maintain the pace. I said, "I understand." He said, "Do you?" I did not answer. He said, "Kevin, I'm going to be straight with you. I think you're rattled by the Vereen Street situation. I think you're overcorrecting. I'm going to put you on a different rotation for a couple of weeks. Industrial buildings, warehouses, nothing residential. Let you cool off, then we'll reevaluate." He said it the way he said things that were both kind and final. I went back to my desk. I sat for a few minutes. Then I went out to my truck and I drove to the next address on my packet, which was a building I had been intending to walk that afternoon. The building was a 2-story duplex on Renault Avenue. The packet listed it as condemned for fire damage, vacant for 16 months, owned by Vinland Realty Trust. I parked. I did the perimeter walk. I noticed immediately that the front yard had recently been mowed. The clippings were still on the grass. There was a child's tricycle on the porch. There were curtains in the front windows, drawn back, fresh. I went to the front door. I knocked. A woman answered. She was perhaps 35 years old. She was holding a baby. There was a young child, maybe 4 years old, behind her in the hallway, staring at me with the kind of frank interest that small children have when a stranger comes to the door. There were other voices in the house. A man's voice, an older woman's voice, the ambient sound of a household at the dinner hour. The woman said, "Yes?" I said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm with the city. I'm doing a routine inspection in the neighborhood. Could I ask how long your family has lived at this address?" She said, 6 years. Why? Is there a problem? I said, "No, ma'am. I think I have the wrong house. I'm sorry for the disturbance." She said, "No problem." She closed the door. I went back to the truck. I sat in the cab. I looked at the address sheet. The address was 4421 Renault Avenue. The duplex was 4421 Renault Avenue. The packet was correct. The contractor was scheduled to begin demolition the following morning. I drove back to the office. I did not return to the building. I did not sign the vacancy attestation. I left it blank in the packet on my desk. That night I sat in my kitchen and I thought about the choice I had to make. I thought about it the way you think about a choice that you already know the answer to, but which you would like, one more time, to consider all the angles of in case there is an angle that lets you out. The angles I considered were these. If I refused to sign, the demolition might still happen, the way 818 Vereen Street had still happened, with my forged signature on the form. If I refused to sign and the demolition happened, the family would be killed in the demolition or would survive and lose their home. If I called the family directly and warned them, I would be acting outside my authority and could be charged with obstruction of a municipal contract, and the family would still need to find a way to prevent the demolition, which they would not be able to do without help. If I called the police, I would be reporting an attempted homicide that I had not been able to substantiate at 818 Vereen Street, and would not be able to substantiate here either until the demolition occurred. If I called a journalist, I would be talking about something I could not prove, with 17 memorized addresses that had been quietly demolished and no documentation of any wrongdoing. I considered, with what I want to call a clear head, the possibility that I was wrong, that there was an explanation, that the records office had crossed wires, that the holding companies were a coincidence, that the family at Renault Avenue was on a different list, that the demolition would be canceled the next morning when Doheny realized the address was occupied. I considered all of these things. Then I drove to the family's house. It was 9 in the evening. The lights were on. I knocked on the door. The same woman answered. I told her plainly that I worked for the city and that her house was scheduled for demolition the next morning. I told her that the records the city had on file showed the house as vacant and owned by a company called Vinland Realty Trust. I told her that I did not know how this had happened, but that it had happened to other houses, and that those houses had been demolished on schedule, and that I was telling her this so she could take whatever action she needed to take. She listened. Her husband came to the door behind her. They listened together. They asked me my name. I gave it to them. They asked for my badge. I gave it to them. They asked me what they should do. I told them I did not know. I told them they should call the news station on the morning shift, the one that did consumer protection segments, because that station had a habit of getting attention quickly. I told them to call the Lawyers Association for an emergency consultation. I told them to put their car in front of the house, to put themselves in the yard, to make themselves visible, because the demolition crew would not start with people on the property. I gave them my phone number. I told them to call me if anything happened. I went home. I did not sleep. In the morning, I drove to the field office. I did not stop at the dispatch counter. I went straight to Doheny's office. He was not yet in. I sat in his chair and I waited. He came in at 7:30. He saw me. His face did the small adjustment of a man who has anticipated a difficult conversation and has decided how to manage it. He said, "Kevin." I said, "I went to the house at 4421 Renault Avenue last night. I told the family their house was scheduled for demolition." He sat down across from me. He did not speak for some time. Then he said, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Because I thought they should know." He said, "That was not your decision to make." I said, "I think it was." He looked at me. He looked at me for a long time. The look was not angry. It was the look of a man who was sorry, in a small managerial way, that things had reached the point at which this conversation was happening. He said, "Kevin, you're going to need to take some time off." I said, "I'm not going to take time off. I'm going to call the newspaper this morning. I'm going to give them 17 addresses. I'm going to give them yours." He said, "Kevin." I said, "I'm going to give them yours." He sat back. He looked tired. He said, "Do what you need to do." I left. I called the newspaper from the parking lot. I gave them my name. I gave them 17 addresses. I gave them Doheny's name. I gave them the names of the holding companies and the law firm. I told them about Renault Avenue and Vereen Street. I told them about the cigarette and the warm counter. I gave them my phone number and asked them to call me back when they had questions. The reporter called me back 40 minutes later. She had questions. I answered them. The conversation took an hour and a half. At the end, she told me she was going to start making calls and that she would be in touch. That was 11 days ago. The Renault Avenue house was not demolished. The contractor arrived on schedule the morning after I spoke to the family. The family was on the porch with their children. There were also 2 cars from the local news in the street. The contractor's foreman called the office. The office called the contractor back 20 minutes later and told him to stand down. The contractor packed up and left. The house is still standing. The family is still in it. That is the only building I have been able to confirm did not come down. I want to record what I have learned in the 11 days since. The reporter has been working on the story. She has confirmed through her own research that 14 of the 17 addresses I gave her were demolished without appearing in the public demolition schedule. She has confirmed that all 17 properties were owned by holding companies represented by the same law firm. She has confirmed that the holding companies are linked through several shell layers to a single private development fund whose principal investor is a member of the redevelopment consortium that contracted with the city to clear the demolition backlog. She has not yet been able to confirm what happened to the people who were inside the demolished buildings. She is working on it. I have not been to the field office in 11 days. Doheny has not called me. Lords has not called me. The city has not formally terminated my employment. My city email, when I checked it yesterday, still works. My access badge, when I tried it at the field office Monday morning, still opens the door. And here is the part of this account that I am writing because I do not know what to do with it. When I checked my email yesterday, there were 11 new packets in my inbox. They had been assigned to me over the past 11 days, 1 or 2 a day, even though I have not been at work. Each packet contains addresses. I opened the most recent one. There are 5 addresses on it. I do not recognize any of them. They are addresses in the older part of the city, north of the river. The packet is for tomorrow. The vacancy attestation forms in the packet are blank. They are waiting for my signature. I have not gone to any of the buildings. I will not be going. I have not signed any of the forms. I will not be signing them. But the system has continued to assign me buildings. The system is generating packets with my name on them every day, regardless of whether I show up. And somewhere downstream of those packets, the demolitions are still being scheduled, and the contractors are still being staged, and the forms are getting signed. I do not know whose signature is on those forms now. I do not know whether someone in the office has been forging my name for 11 days, or whether they have moved on to someone else's name, or whether the system has some other mechanism I have not yet identified. What I know is that my refusal to sign did not stop the work. My refusal to walk the buildings did not stop the work. My absence from the office did not stop the work. The work continues with my name still attached to it, and the only thing that has changed is that I am no longer in the building when the building is supposed to be empty. The reporter is going to publish her story this Sunday. I do not know what will happen after that. I have a list of 17 addresses memorized, and now there are 12 more in my email, and they are also addresses, and they are also assigned to me, and I do not know whether I am still the coordinator for them, in some sense the city's records will accept, or whether I am simply a name that the system has not yet replaced. I am writing this in case the story does not run. I am writing this in case something happens to me between now and Sunday. I am writing this in case anyone later wants to know that I knew. I want to be clear about one last thing. The first form I signed on my first day on the job was for a small commercial building on Hadley Street that had been a corner grocery in the 1970s and had been vacant since the late 1990s. I walked it. It was empty. I signed the form. The building was demolished the next morning. I drove past it the day after demolition, the way I would later drive past all of them. Except that on my first day, I drove past it because I wanted to see my work, and I was proud of the work, and I wanted to see the lot. The lot was empty. There was construction fencing around it. There was a small sign on the fencing that said the future site of a development I no longer remember the name of. I want to record that I felt good about that lot. I felt that I had done something useful. I had cleared a derelict building from a city that had too many of them, and I had done it correctly, and the city was a little bit closer to whatever the city was trying to become. I drove home that day feeling like I had picked the right job. I want this to be on the record as well, because if the story comes out the way I think it will, there are going to be people who say I should have known earlier, that the signs were there, that anyone with a conscience would have refused the second building, the third, the 10th, and I want those people to know that I felt good about the first one. I felt good about the first one and the next 40 after it. I did not feel anything about the warm counter on Oxnard Avenue. I felt embarrassed about the cigarette. I felt rattled about the wall cavity, but I let Doheny manage it, the way I had been trained to let him manage things. I felt nothing in particular about most of the buildings, because most of the buildings were exactly what they were supposed to be. It was not until Vereen Street that I felt anything I could call wrong. By Vereen Street, I had signed almost 2,000 forms. I am going to stop writing now. The packet for tomorrow is on my kitchen table. There are 5 addresses on it. I am going to drive to all 5 tomorrow morning before the contractor mobilizes. I am not going to sign anything. I am going to knock on the doors. If anyone answers, I am going to tell them what I told the family on Renault Avenue. If no one answers, I am going to do the only thing I can think of to do, which is to write the address on the porch in chalk so the contractor sees it when they pull up. I do not know if the contractor will stop. I do not know if anyone will stop. I do not know if my being there matters anymore. But the buildings on the packet have my name attached to them, and I would like to be able to say, when the time comes, that I went. I am writing this down so that whatever happens at those 5 addresses tomorrow, there is a version of why I went that exists outside the city's records. The city's records will say, I was assigned. They will be correct. I was assigned. I am still being assigned. The packets keep coming. The forms keep getting signed. I am going anyway.